Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webcast entitled Post-Construction Overview and Introduction to Smart Growth and Low-Impact Development. This webcast is sponsored by EPA's Office of Wastewater Management. My name is Ron Orell. I am with Tetra Tech and will moderate today's session. Thank you for joining us today after last week's technical difficulty. We do apologize and are glad to have you aboard today. We will get started in a few moments. While we wait for others to join, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. The materials in this webcast have been reviewed by EPA staff for technical accuracy. However, the views of the speakers and the speakers' organizations are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the EPA. Mention of any commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean that EPA endorses them. We will have several question and answer sessions during the webcast. To ask a question, simply type your question in the text box located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Then click on the Submit Question button. You don't need to wait until the question and answer period to submit your questions. In fact, we do encourage you to submit your questions early. And today, in celebration of our unofficial national holiday known as March Madness, let's have a little fun and spice things up. When you submit your question, tell us who you're picking for the Final Four. I'll start. I have Duke, UCLA, Connecticut, and Boston College. My picks, of course, are for entertainment purposes only. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. Due to the high number of participants, all questions may not be answered. However, today's speaker's contact information is provided on your screen should you have questions following the webcast. You may also use the Ask a Question area to alert us to any technical difficulties you encounter. Please include a telephone number where you can be reached, and we will help you troubleshoot your problem. For basic troubleshooting information, please click on the Help button located on your screen. There will also be several occasions when our presenter will ask you questions. The presenter will post the questions in your slide window. Please submit your answers in that same slide window. At the end of the webcast, you will be asked to complete an evaluation survey. The survey will appear in a pop-up window, so please turn off your pop-up blocker at this time. Finally, this webcast will be archived indefinitely, so you can access it after today's live presentation. The archived webcast will be posted by March 21st on this same website. Okay, I think we're ready to kick off this session. Today's speakers are Nikos Singelis and Jeff Anderson. Nikos is a senior program analyst with EPA's NPDES Stormwater program. He has been with the program for the last 6 years and works on many projects aimed at helping Phase 2 communities implement this challenging program. Jeff Anderson directs the Development, Community, and Environment Division at EPA. The division is responsible for EPA's smart growth work. Jeff has worked on smart growth issues at EPA since 1994. Okay, we have an excellent presentation today, so let's get started. I'll now turn the microphone over to Nikos. Good afternoon, Nikos.
Good afternoon, Ron. Thank you for the introduction, and welcome to everybody. And I just cannot tell you how happy we are to be here and to experience live conditions this time. And we are glad that you have persevered and have stuck with us, and we hope to provide you with an entertaining 2 hours today. So let's get right into it. We started this series of webcasts this year. We've been doing quite a lot of training on the Phase 2 program for the last 2 years, and that is focused mostly on live workshops. We do a series of 2-day workshops, and we do 5 or 6 of them each year around the country. But we recognize that many people can't attend a 2-day workshop, can't get travel authorizations and that sort of stuff. And so we felt that we would give webcasts a try as an easy way for people to get up to speed on different elements of the Phase 2 program right from their desks. So this is the first in a series, and for right now we're planning to do one every other month until September, and we will be covering one topic each time. Sometimes that topic will be a basic topic, like today's topic is a 101, so it's an introductory level course. And other times we'll have a more advanced topic. For instance, our next course will be on stormwater utilities, and so that one's labeled 201. So if you or your colleagues, already have a pretty good understanding. You can choose which ones you'll attend and which ones you're really interested in. But we hope all of them will have some new information for you. It'll certainly be a lot better than reading our regulations, and hopefully more entertaining. Without further ado, we're going to, as Ron mentioned, we are going to ask you questions from time to time. This is one of the cool features in this webcast. And so our first question today is, just because we'd like to get a really accurate poll of how many people are attending, because we know some people are in conference rooms or in groups together. So if you can just quickly type in the number of people that are in your room with you, and then hit the Submit Answer button, that will be very helpful. And we'll give you just a couple seconds to do that. It's really quite easy. And as Ron mentioned, during the presentation we have some additional questions that we'll be asking you. And some of those we'll be able to show you the answers immediately, too. So you'll see that coming up in a minute. All right, I think everybody's had enough time to answer this question, so we'll move on to the next thing. So if nothing else, one thing that you should take away from this brilliant presentation today is the answer to this very important question: is stormwater one word or two? A scintillating topic that has vexed many people in different agencies and different organizations around the country. So here again we have another poll question. So answer whether you think, in your humble opinion, that stormwater is one word, yes or no. And again, we'll give you just a couple seconds on this question, and on this one we'll be able to actually show you the answers that you have typed in. So again, select yes or no, and then hit the Submit Answer button. And just after we finish this, I'll give you a brief overview of the subjects that we're going to talk about today, and then we will jump into the presentation. Okay, let's see what everybody has said here. Let's see, how do we do this? We're still learning some of the technology here. There you go. Okay, so the votes are in, and it looks like 76% say stormwater is one word, and 23% out there, who are quite deficient apparently, think that it's two words. And just a funny little story about this, we in EPA, if you check around in our website and some of our older documents, you'll find that we too are confused. And for a long time we used stormwater as two words, and we bucked the trend because we know that most states are using one word and most people in publications are using one word. So we have changed recently, and there were many arguments about that. But ultimately the deciding factor was the Clean Water Act, as it should be, and the Clean Water Act does indeed list stormwater as one word. Okay, so that was a little bit of fun there. So let's talk about what we are going to cover today. So we have 5 basic things that we're going to try to cover. The first is just a brief overview of the water quality impacts from post-construction stormwater runoff. Just want to give you a little bit of information on the kind of problems that are out there and why the whole post-construction program is very important. Then we want to give you some basics on the post-construction minimum measure. What are the requirements? That'll go by very briefly. And then what are the basic elements of a good post-construction program at the municipal level? I know many folks on the line are from municipal governments, either local governments or city governments or county governments. And we also have a variety of other people on the line as well. And this presentation is focused primarily for local stormwater program managers. So we are going to focus on that. And then we're going to move into 2 new areas. We're going to talk about some trends in development, kind of the big picture thing. And Jeff Anderson is going to speak about EPA's smart growth initiatives. And then we're going to connect that to another interesting topic, low impact development. Okay, so another poll question here for you. We'd like to know now who you represent or who you work for. So we have a variety of choices there. You can just click one of those buttons and then submit your answer. So if you work for a Phase 2 municipality, select that. We also have Phase 1 municipalities. And if you work for a municipality and you don't know which one you are, well, you have some homework to do. We also have categories for state, federal, consultants, and the other category if you don't fit into any of those. So just take a second and click.
Nikos, at this time, I'd like to remind folks that to submit their answers to these questions, please do so in the slide window, not the questions window. So click on whichever answer best suits you, and then click Submit Answer, please.
Yeah, don't use the question. Don't type in an answer like I work for a municipal government. Just click the little radio button next to it, and it'll darken, and then you can hit Submit Answer right in the picture itself. All right? Again, just a couple more seconds to answer this, and then we will see what the results are. Okay. And I will show you those results right now. There you go. So it looks like a majority are from Phase 2 municipalities, as we had thought. We also have a good representation from Phase 1s, as well as state governments and consultants and others. So that looks good. Now, we will now move on to the next bit here. So let's jump into this presentation. We decided to focus on post-construction out of the 6 minimum measures as the first topic of conversation today because for two reasons, essentially. First of all, the post-construction minimum measure we've been gathering as we've been traveling around the country and talking to local governments is perhaps the most challenging of the minimum measures. Not that the other ones are easy by any stretch of the imagination, but we've been finding that many people have a lot of questions about how to do this, and when we ask them how well they're progressing in developing their programs, they seem to be having the most trouble in the post-construction area. And the other reason is that, and this is not a scientific sort of thing, but if you think about the implications of post-construction or really their permanent stormwater controls is what we're talking about, the things that will be on the landscape for the long term. We have also a construction program, and, that covers that site during the time that it's under construction, which, may be a period of a few weeks or a few months. But in the post-construction area, we're talking about time frames that maybe is 100 years or more. So we really think that it's important to get this right from the beginning, because otherwise we'll have to be living with mistakes for the next 100 years. So we really do need to focus on this area, and I think it's perhaps arguably the most important of the 6 minimum measures really over the long term to ensure, good water quality across the country. And, of course, every area is going to have slightly different issues to deal with, but we're all sort of after the same basic objective. Okay, so why is stormwater a problem? As many of you know, every 2 years we ask the states to submit water quality information in the National Water Quality Inventory, or as it's technically known as the 305B report. And we know that report is flawed and understates many things, but just to give you some examples here of the kinds of problems that are being identified that are being caused by urban runoff. Some 34,000 miles of impaired rivers and streams, almost 4 million acres of impaired lakes, and 5,000 square miles of estuary are all being reported as being caused by urban runoff. And we know that this is an underreporting, but it does give you kind of a flavor. And in almost every case, as sources go, urban runoff is among the top 3 sources that are contributing to water quality problems. And so what we're trying to avoid is situations like this, where in this picture you see, what would on a normal day look like a relatively healthy small stream here, but you can see during this heavy rain event that there's clearly something going on in the watershed that's causing this kind of brown mucky water. So we're trying to look, beyond the day-to-day chemistry. We're trying to look, at the watershed as a whole and what kind of impacts are happening, particularly during these storm events. Some of the common causes of stormwater problems, obviously impervious surfaces is the number one issue, and we'll be talking a lot about that today as we talk both about smart growth and low-impact development. But as we develop more and more land, we are increasing the amount of impervious surfaces out there and changing the basic hydrology of the watersheds that we live in, and changing that in some very significant ways. EPA sort of grew up in the NPDES program focusing on water chemistry issues, but the stormwater program is really teaching us that we need to look at more than just water chemistry or pollutants, but we're also now very concerned about volumes and about velocity, and those two things sort of go hand in hand. The more volume you have, the more impervious surfaces create more volume, create more velocity, and those issues can be particularly destructive to small streams. Of course, we're also looking at the chemical aspects of that, from anything from sediment to nutrients to other toxic chemicals. And we'll be talking in a minute about groundwater recharge and base flow. And also, again, looking just beyond the sort of water chemistry issues, but to consider things, like what's going on the banks and beyond the banks, riparian areas and that sort of thing. And of course, we're seeing increases in flooding in particular areas, and we need to, keep track of that. We're making changes again in the hydrology, and are we causing, more expenses than in trying to deal with flooding? Also, increased erosion of stream banks, channelization, and increased sedimentation. And finally, of course, as we've mentioned, the chemical pollution issues, changes in biological populations, particularly in the larger fish species such as trout and salmon, are particularly being affected. And all of these things are linked together. And also of interest is temperature as well, as we again change the physical characteristics of the areas around our streams and lakes. We're changing temperatures, and temperatures can have a vast effect on the fish species and invertebrates and whatnot that are in a particular stream. And actually, temperature is listed as a pollutant within the Clean Water Act as well. So eventually we may have specific requirements for temperature as a pollutant even. I think we've covered many of these things already, but these are the common pollutants that we see in urban stormwater. Obviously, sediment nutrients being the top two, and you can see a variety of other things. One acronym in there that some of you may not know is the last one, which is polyaromatic hydrocarbons. And typically in an urban area, these are coming off of parking lots. These PAHs dissolve in water, and particularly when a parking lot is resealed, we're finding that heavy loads of these water-soluble pollutants are coming off these parking lots, and they're very toxic to fish and other wildlife. And there's an interesting new study out from the National Geologic Survey, which is noted on our website. So if you want to know more about this particular issue, there's quite a bit more to find out. So again, the next slide has some pictures on it. We're talking about sediment being dumped out, as noted in the left there, when a stream hits a larger body of water. Algal blooms being caused by excess nutrients there on the right. impacts from construction, more or less in the middle there, and also cold weather events such as snowmelt. Often people don't really sort of think about that, but an awful lot of pollutants will get built up on the landscape during cold weather, and then when the snow melts and the spring rains come, you'll have particularly high concentrations of pollutants. Some common sources of pollutants out there are, of course, are a lot of our daily activities. Roads, parking lots contribute all sorts of pollutants. And also some of the choices that we make as homeowners, such as fertilizing lawns, the herbicides that we choose or the insecticides that we choose. All these things, all these basically millions of little choices that everyone makes every day are affecting the quality of stormwater. And some more pictures here of common problems. Trash and debris, of course, is a significant problem in many areas, as well as, again, algal blooms, oil from parking lots, leaking from cars and things, various toxic wastes, and, of course, sediment being the number one pollutant, believe it or not, in the United States. So we come to another poll question, and the question is here, does the watershed that you live in, let's pick the watershed that you live in, that stream, lake, coastal water, bay, do you know if problems are being caused by stormwater? And if so, is that the leading cause, the secondary cause, no, or not sure? So again, the same routine, just click on that little white area to choose one of those answers, and then hit Submit Answer right on the screen, and we'll show you the results in just a second. All right, let's take a look here and see how people are describing this situation. Yes, we have quite a lot of results. This is really a nifty feature of this webcast here, that we're able to do this. So there you can see the results. Some 59% basically have said yes, it's the leading cause, and another 20% are saying it's a secondary issue. So that's a pretty overwhelming answer there. Only a very few said no, only about 7%. So that's pretty telling as to the extent of the problem, even just from our sort of anecdotal, kind of polling right here today. So we have another one. If you said yes in the previous question, select as many as you want from this list. There are little check boxes this time, and you can select several. So maybe pick, the two top issues that are in your watershed where you live again, and then we'll show you those results as well. So again, you can choose several of these, but maybe, so it doesn't get too confusing, let's just pick, two. All right, and let's see how this one is going here. All right, this will be interesting. I'll push that out to you. So we have all kinds of different things here. 82%, 83% said sedimentation. Lots with turbidity. Again, 70 or 66% with nutrients, bacteria problems, bank erosion. So all the sorts of things that we were talking about in those slides, you're experiencing in your local watersheds. And I believe that if you want to come back to these poll results when we put up the archived version in a couple days, these poll results will be there as well. All right, let's move on. I mentioned to you that as we develop land, we're increasingly changing the basic hydrology of watersheds, and that those changes can be very significant. In this graph that we borrowed from the Center for Watershed Protection, you can see two things going on. First, the pre-development line is the solid white line, and you can see that there's lower peaks there. They come a little bit later. And interestingly enough, note on the left, that in pre-development conditions you have higher base flow. And here by base flow, we mean basically that shallow groundwater that is moving through the soils, at a couple feet down, that provides kind of the base flow for streams and rivers during dry periods. So as we develop, the dotted line shows you, and this is just an artist's conception, this isn't a scientific document by any means, but shows you the kinds of changes that we're experiencing. Obviously the peaks are much higher. Also notice that when the storm starts, that peak flow happens a lot faster. There's a secondary peak that's significantly bigger. And again, note that base flow. Again, because we're not allowing rainwater to infiltrate into the ground, we're lowering that base flow. So that base flow is that lowered base flow is causing our, particularly the smaller streams, to dry up during dry periods. It can also be affecting our groundwater resources as well. Okay, just a quick case study here. This first slide shows Blakesley Creek in Michigan, a very small watershed that was mostly undeveloped. You can see small residential areas down there in the southeast corner. And in this next slide, you'll see in just a 4-year time frame, some major development was going on. And now that middle section of the watershed is almost completely developed. So it's gone from forest to residential. And they did some before and after studies to measure the hydrology. And here's what was going on in an average rainstorm, pre-development and post-development. And to make it quick, you can see that there's about a 70% increase in the peak flow. That is, the height of the peak is now 70% more. There's a 170% increase in overall runoff volume. And what was the former peak there, that level of water flowing through that stream, which was, for a very short period of time there, a few minutes, now lasts for 4 hours in the new scenario. So those are some fairly significant changes there. The next slide is from the Center for Watershed Protection as well, and they've done a lot of studies in watersheds around the country. And basically what they have been finding through their research is that there's a strong correlation between the percent impervious and the quality of that watershed. And as you can see on this graph, basically in that when impervious surfaces are limited to about 0 to 10% of the entire watershed, that you're in that relatively, possibly, good area. But as you move up beyond just 10%, the impacts start to occur. And it's when you get over 25%, you certainly almost inevitably have a watershed that is not supporting its designated use and is being severely impacted by stormwater runoff. A couple more examples also from the Center for Watershed Protection. Here's a stream where the watershed has 5% impervious cover. And for those of you who've had a geomorphology class, you will know to look at this picture, you can see this is a relatively healthy stream. The banks are stable. We've got that good pool and riffle structure as you move down the stream. There's good tree cover around. The water quality looks good. There's not too much material moving through the bed of the stream. And now we'll move up in the next picture a little bit to that 10% level. And here you can see very clearly that the stream banks are now eroded. You can see the tree roots are being undercut. You can see that there's a lot more material in the bed of the stream. And you can also see that that nice pool and riffle structure now is being disrupted because there's so much material moving through the bed. And one more example here. At the 20% level, you can clearly see what's going on. Obviously, in this particular case, some of that tree cover has been removed. You can see the down-cutting of the stream banks and the severe erosion problems there. I believe we have another slide also at 20% here. where, again, this just severe erosion problems. Another little interesting anecdote is that they've been doing, a couple scientists have done some studies on watersheds, on a couple small watersheds to determine what the source of TSS was in their water. And they had thought that, and these were relatively urbanized areas, and they thought that that sediment, that dirt basically that they're finding in the water column, was coming from areas within the watershed, like parking lots and people's lawns and construction sites and things like that. You know, they thought that the vast majority was coming from those sorts of areas. And what they ended up finding by studying this very carefully is that actually a lot of that was coming from the stream banks themselves, because during rain events there's so much water going through here and the erosion is so high that it's just tearing away at the stream banks and suspending all that material. So I believe in one watershed they found that 75% was coming from the stream banks. The other one was about 60%, if I remember correctly. So it's a very interesting thing if you're trying to prevent a TSS problem. You really need to sort of look carefully as to where that might be coming from. And the answer might be that it's due to volume, or a majority of it is due to volume, and maybe not so much from other sources within the watershed. Okay, now we have a chance for you to ask questions, and I hope you've been submitting questions all along as I've been talking. And so we'll take the first question, Ron. What do we have?
Well, Nikos, they have been submitting questions, but nobody's telling me who they're picking for the Final Four.
Oh, that's not good.
Well, our first question comes from John, who wants to know, does the Clean Water Act legislate runoff volume?
No, in fact, there are no, in the whole stormwater area, there are no sort of numeric numbers in the Clean Water Act that have to be met. The Clean Water Act describes, and EPA's regulations that implement those provisions describe programs, mostly at the local level, that need to be put in place, some at the state level as well, to cover things like construction and post-construction and that sort of stuff. But they don't contain specific targets for volume. Now, this is something that a permit writer could possibly include into a permit. To my knowledge, that hasn't happened at the moment, but it's certainly within the possibility in an NPDES permit to describe targets for pollutants and that sort of thing. I know some also local governments have set targets or limits on the impervious cover for a particular site as a percentage, but that would obviously be a local decision and not part of the Clean Water Act. Kevin in Indiana wants to know, do you have existing post-construction specification references that MS4s can refer to, and where would those be located? We do have some information, and there will be some resources that we will show you at the end of this slide presentation on post-construction, different aspects of that. And there are some good examples particularly from Phase 1 municipalities. And we have a series of case studies up on our website as well that describe some of that. And then finally, the last thing I'll mention is that we are developing a comprehensive manual on the whole post-construction program that we hope to issue by the end of 2006. And Ron, do we have another question there? Yeah, I think we have time for one more question, and we'll ask one from Anna, who is in Wisconsin. She wants to know, what are some oxygen-demanding substances that you refer to? They can be any sort of organic material that might end up in the water. For instance, even just leaves. When leaves biodegrade, that process of them biodegrading takes oxygen out of the water. Also, for instance, nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus might support an algal bloom. So you might have a lot of algae in the water, and when that algae dies, then it becomes a oxygen-demanding substance, and in the process of its decomposition, it's taking oxygen out of the water. It's a big problem that we have here in the Chesapeake Bay, for instance. Okay, thanks, Nikos. I think we should go ahead and resume the presentation. Okay, the next section here, we're going to be talking briefly about the post-construction minimum measure, and we'll just touch very briefly on what is required in the regulations, and then we'll then be talking about what sort of are the elements of a good program. But first, let's talk about what the benefits are, because a lot of people say, oh, this is a requirement, ooh, you know, I'm under the gun, I've got to do something. But there's actually quite a few benefits to a community for putting together a good stormwater program. The first, obviously, which will make me happy, is meeting those regulatory requirements, but that's certainly not your primary reason for doing this. Obviously, reducing flooding, improving local water quality. You know, there's overwhelming polls out there that show that citizens want more and more environmental protection. They want waters to be cleaner, and they're particularly concerned about waters that are in their neighborhood, places where they might go swimming or fishing, places where parks, adjoin waters and they walk, or just enjoy the shoreline, boating, and that sort of thing. Also to prevent erosion, to make sure that we do have fish and birds and all kinds of other interesting wildlife out there. And then finally, actually, to make sure that a good stormwater program will actually help a city both reduce its capital infrastructure costs and its long-term maintenance costs for all that stormwater infrastructure that's out there. And we'll touch on that a little bit later. A couple of other things, interestingly, this is one of the few places where you can kind of do the right thing for the environment and also have improved aesthetics, and we'll show you some examples later on of some stormwater best management practices that actually look nice and can be amenities in a community. I think we've touched upon some of these others, but I will also show you later on a little study from Maryland that shows that property values go up too as we implement some of these kinds of controls and programs. So a little bit about what the measure says. The measure requires a community to develop a program, basically using an ordinance or some other regulatory means, but most of the time it's going to be via ordinance, to address runoff from new development and redevelopment projects that disturb 1 acre or more. And as you may remember, in Phase 1, that was started in the early 90s, that was 5 acres or more, but now with Phase 2, it's been dropped down to 1 acre. And let me point out, too, that does cover new development and redevelopment, but does not cover existing areas. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go along, because in many cases we're going to also need to address existing areas to find retrofits to problems that we already have, and implement those solutions if we really expect to meet our water quality goals. But technically that's not required by the Phase 2 regulations. And then, of course, we're going to be using structural BMPs and non-structural means as well, so a combination of things that sit there on the ground plus, sort of good housekeeping practices to make all this happen. And another thing that's incredibly important to a post-construction program is having a very good operation and maintenance program, because these BMPs can fail very easily if they're not properly maintained, and we're losing all the water quality benefits if we don't keep up that maintenance. Let's see. And of course, the BMPs should be chosen for the particular community. And that really means sort of the particular characteristics of that area of the country. In certain places, certain BMPs will work better than others, depending on soil types, the amount of rain, weather patterns in that area, the physical characteristics of a particular watershed, and that sort of stuff. So we are encouraging, both at the state level and at the community level, that they really try to find a suite of BMPs that work well in their area, and perhaps to weed out some that are not as effective. We also think that watershed planning, that the stormwater program really needs to be integrated into watershed planning efforts. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But also to involve citizens in the kinds of decision-making that go along with watershed planning and the stormwater program as well, will help sort of the program live over the long term. And And the last thing I will mention is that we also need to evaluate existing ordinances that may have been created by other departments and their programs to see how they impact stormwater as well. And again, a few slides from now, I'll show you some examples of those. Okay, so we have another pause here for questions, and let's just take two on this so we can stay on track. Ron, are there some more questions there?
Oh, you better believe it.
Oh, that's good. So we have an active audience out there. Is that right?
We sure do. You wouldn't want to know what some of the things are. Let's start with Pedro in Kansas, who wants to know, if temperature is a pollutant, what can we do to control it?
Well, there's a couple things that can be done. Obviously, minimizing impervious surfaces would be one, because as rainwater travels over surfaces, particularly blacktop, it's going to heat up quite a bit. So any effort that we can make to minimize impervious surfaces will keep those temperatures down. The other major thing that we can do is make sure that we have good riparian cover around our streams and rivers, and around our shorelines on lakes for that matter. But it's particularly sensitive for streams and rivers. Having good mature trees there that provide shade keep those temperatures down. Particularly trout and salmon are very temperature sensitive, and when we change that temperature even by a few degrees, we can wipe out an entire trout population. Okay.
Kathy wants to know, do you know if numeric limits may be required for Phase 2 stormwater discharges?
That, as I mentioned before, is always a possibility. I think right now this program is more involved kind of with what we call this kind of the best available technology approach, where we're basically using our best judgment to put in place BMPs that we think will do a good job. And then we, of course, need to evaluate those BMPs to see whether they're really working. And if we find that they're not working, we may need to change our plans. But for the most part, right now, this program is really not talking about numeric limits. And part of that is a practicality issue. You know, how do you assign a numeric limit to, you know, a particular site during a rain event? It's very difficult. The just whole logistics of it are very difficult. That's not to say that in the future it won't happen, and maybe it will happen on a broader geographic scale, and that numeric limit might be translated into using particular BMPs that are found to be more effective. But I think right now we're not really at that point in this program, and we're talking about sort of best judgment in putting BMPs in place.
Okay, to stay on schedule, I would suggest that we move forward, Nikos, with our next set of slides.
Okay, this next little bit kind of talks about what are the good elements, what are the things that we need to put in place at the community level that will make up for a good stormwater program, post-construction stormwater program. So the first thing here, and again, this kind of gets into this issue of how difficult this particular minimum measure is for many folks out there, and that oftentimes, just as an example, the stormwater program will be assigned to the Public Works Department to carry out. And that may work fine for some of the other parts of this program. But in the post-construction area, really it's got to involve a lot of people in a lot of different parts of the local government and at different levels within that local government in order to make it really effective. So one of the things that we really recommend strongly is that folks modify their general or comprehensive plans. Most states sort of require that of a community, but to get some kind of recognition in that plan for the stormwater program and the importance it plays and its interactions with things like zoning and planning, which are obviously different departments. So we think that's sort of a key piece to the success of this and a success of trying to get other folks within the local government involved in the program. Of course, having an ordinance in place, we mentioned that already, and also having design standards. And we recommend, and we'll talk about this more, that those design standards not be in the ordinance so that they can be modified and improved as time goes on, but they should be referenced in the ordinance. Also, you'll need a process to review and approve stormwater plans as they come in for new development and redevelopment, for that matter. Many folks have kind of environmental review process already, or a construction review process. So these things can be integrated together. They don't necessarily need to be separate, but the topic needs to be covered. Finally, you're going to need, as we mentioned before, maintenance is sort of the key to making this successful as well. Once we have things out on the ground, we really need good maintenance. So we need systems out there to keep track of where these BMPs are, to inspect them from time to time, and to make sure that they're getting the adequate maintenance that they need. It is a requirement, but it's probably not something that you're going to use all that often. It's some kind of penalty provisions to make sure that in case you have people that really don't want to do this, that you do have some leverage to make them do things. Again, in most, I think, communities have found that those are not used very frequently, that they simply by talking to property owners, they can get the kind of compliance they need once those property owners are properly educated about what's going on. And then finally, training and education from anybody from city employees to contractors and developers out there. So these are the major elements. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about this comprehensive plan. As I mentioned before, most states have some kind of requirement for a locality to develop some kind of, and the words may be different, the titles may be different, some kind of general or comprehensive plan. But again, getting this kind of, whether you call it watershed planning or stormwater program, integrated into that definitely makes sense. It gives your program recognition at all levels of the government and some credibility, makes other people aware of what's going on and what needs to happen, and gets them to incorporate the stormwater considerations in the decisions that they're making, which is as we talk later on today about smart growth, when we get into the whole sort of planning and zoning area, we really need to have those folks on board as well. We talked some about the environmental review procedures, and again, we sort of talk sometimes somewhat artificially, separating construction and post-construction as two sort of separate programs. But really, in reality, I think on the ground, these things are integrated together, and they're just aspects of the same sort of review process. So when you're reviewing construction plans for a new development, you should be having the developer include their post-construction plans at the same time, review them all at once, make sure that they all make sense together and for the long term. And lastly is the ordinance, and the Phase 2 requirements do require the city to develop an ordinance, and you will also need some kind of stormwater design standards. Now, it could be that you choose to develop your own. It could be that you reference, say, a state manual that you find to be quite acceptable, that sort of thing. We definitely recommend, again, that you keep your design standards out of your ordinance so that it's easy to change and update those things. And you're going to need to, describe the BMPs and the sizing criteria that fit the conditions within your community. Sizing criteria particularly will vary by the amount of rainfall and the rainfall patterns in a particular area. So you're going to need to consider all of that. And of course, you want your ordinance to specifically say that developers must follow those design standards. That's your sort of legal leverage to move forward. Okay, so we have a little break here with a poll question. And so let's find out now if your city or county already has in place a stormwater ordinance that meets sort of the basic descriptions that we've just given you. So again, you have a couple choices. Just choose one of those, and we'll show you the results of that in just a couple seconds. And obviously, you don't necessarily have to know if it meets exactly, but if you think that it covers some of those basic elements that we have just talked about, just indicate that as a yes. All right, let's see what everybody has said here. Okay, and I will show you this. Wow. Now, this is quite different than any time I've asked this question over and over again in all the training sessions that we've done over the last couple of years, and I've never seen a response like this before. So this is very interesting. Most of the time, most people answer no. So here, some 54% are saying yes, and another 21 or 22% are saying they're working on it. Only 12% said no. Wow, that's astounding. Usually it's exactly the opposite. So I guess the folks that are signing on to this webcast today are the ones that are really in the vanguard and are way ahead of everybody else. And the folks that come to our 2-day trainings, most people laggards. Well, that's very interesting. All right, let's move on a little bit. Let's see here. Okay, just a few seconds on this. I think we've covered it all already. Ron's giving me indications that I need to speed up, so we'll try to do that as well. There's some information here on the plan review process. Again, this covers new development and redevelopment, and it would be your choice to figure out some possibilities for retrofitting existing development as well. We have seen some cities that have some requirements or some incentive programs for getting stormwater BMPs onto existing development. And that can often be accomplished also if you have some kind of a stormwater fee or a stormwater utility with some kind of a price that's based on impervious surface. And if you set that in the right way, you can provide some just voluntary incentive for people to reduce impervious surfaces on their sites. Again, you're going to want to look at both construction and post-construction probably at the same time. And I think this is also a key time to look at the long-term operation and maintenance of those BMPs. You want to make sure that it's clearly understood who's responsible, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. In fact, we'll talk about that right now. As I've said several times before, maintenance is really the key to the program. Last year we were in Tennessee, and we had a case study speaker from one of the communities there in Tennessee, and that community had made a choice a long time ago that they were going to that the homeowners were going to maintain many of the BMPs that were on site. And so they did a survey. They spent a couple months, and they traveled around to every single stormwater BMP, large and small, within that community, and they assessed that BMP as to how well it was being maintained. And they found an enormous amount of complete failures, so many that they were really shocked at how badly things had gotten out of hand. So this leads me to sort of my first key point in all this, is that communities really need to make a very strategic decision about who is responsible for maintenance in the long term. And, there's a variety of choices or combinations of choices out there, but basically, and there's pros and cons to both sort of sets of answers. If you take on all the maintenance yourself, that is the city or county does, then obviously you're going to have high expenditures for maintenance crews. However, on the plus side, you do gain control, over that, and it's more predictable. If you choose to go with homeowners, either associations or individuals, you're losing some of that control, but you're reducing your costs as well. But don't forget that you're going to need a good training program, and a training program that goes on and on to educate the homeowners and the homeowners associations about how to do proper maintenance. And so it's not quite a free ride to just say, well, the homeowners are going to do it, because we're finding that they don't. And, any of us that live in sort of a homeowner community understand that the officers change all the time and people move in and out, and the knowledge base quickly disappears. And so 1 year, people might know how to maintain that swale that runs along the property. But 2 years from now, the home ownership and the board may have changed, and they no longer know how to do it. So that's the reason for a really good sort of ongoing training program, as well as an inspection program to make sure that things are happening. Another thing that communities are finding is that they need a good tracking system. Some that have a GIS system already within the community can use that or use aspects of that to track their BMPs and the maintenance that's happening on them. And also, I would suggest what we sort of call variable enforcement as well. Anything from just writing a letter on city stationery, saying that we found this to be a problem, and then having a way of that escalate upwards, so that, if problems are repeating, that you have a way of dealing with that. But you need to start with a pretty soft approach, and I think most communities are finding that those soft approaches work as long as you get the attention of the person that's responsible. So to me, this is a key question, and it's a key thing that needs to really be thought about and decided kind of up front before you end up with lots and lots of BMPs that you're responsible for and you really didn't anticipate that in your maintenance budget. I'm not going to talk about this for long. We've covered this already, but it gives you some basic ideas about that kind of escalating, and I put it in quotes, enforcement there. And training and education, again, we've talked about this some already, but gives you some ideas about not only city staff, but depending on your setup, about educating developers when they put those things in the first place and how they're designing them, and then whoever is responsible for maintaining those in the long term. Okay, so now we turn to another poll question here for you, and we're just wondering if you know who's responsible for maintaining BMPs in your city or county. Do you think that the city or county does almost all of it, let's say? Are homeowners associations responsible for the vast majority? Maybe a combination, or are you just not sure? So again, take a few seconds to click on one of those answers and hit the Submit Answer button, and we'll see what the results of that will be. I think this could be very interesting, too, judging from the last one. All right, let's see. Let's take a shot here and see what this says. Okay, and I think you can see the results there. Interesting, as we might expect, sort of the combination approach maybe is the most common. Interestingly, about 20% don't know. And it looks like city-county government is also in there, about 25%. And it may be in reality that it's more, maybe a little, I would say, more common for the city-county to have responsibility, maybe more so than indicated here, just in my bit of experience. But again, if you think about all those maintenance issues, you can see sort of the pluses and minuses and pros and cons to any of these sorts of scenarios and what that means for maintenance. Okay, I think we're going to pause for questions again. Ron, does anybody have anything to ask?
Oh, they're flowing in. For those of you who have been submitting questions about, related to the poll questions, I guess, asking how many people are participating, I can't give you a definite answer at this point as to how many are responding to the questions, but I can tell you that we have over 700 lines being taken up, so you can assume that these numbers are pretty high. So let's get to the questions, and Sandy from Kentucky has submitted his final 4 picks.
Yay, we got one!
Sandy goes with Texas, Memphis, Connecticut, and Boston College, and I mentioned that Sandy is in Kentucky, home of the University of Kentucky. Interesting choices. Sandy wants to know, does EPA envision statewide BMP manuals, or guidance documents, regulations, etc., in future permit terms, or is this always going to fall on the individual communities?
I think there will be more and more guidance as time goes on. And certainly one of the ways that the NPDES program is set up, is we have 5-year permit terms. And if you look at the regulations, we've anticipated during the first 5 years of the Phase 2 program, which goes from 2003 to 2008, that communities would, during that time period, be getting their programs up to speed. And then I think when we move into the next permit cycle, past 2008, that we're going to be looking more carefully at how these programs are operating and whether they're really being effective. But I still see us basically being in a guidance and technical assistance kind of mode, both at the EPA level and the state level.
Okay. John in North Carolina is writing about a big issue in North Carolina, but probably applicable in just about every state. He wants to know of any suggestions that you have for ensuring adequate long-term BMP operation and maintenance. Who will pay for this? Homeowners, local governments, Nikos?
Well, unfortunately, my checkbook just won't cover it. But as I mentioned before, this is something that really needs to be thought of as kind of a strategic question. And again, getting at this idea that it's just kind of not making decisions on their own, but really, discussing it all the way up to the top with the city council, the mayor, the city manager, whichever one that you have, so that they really sort of understand the implications of the decisions that are possible, and what the financial implications will be, and what the responsibilities will be in terms of training and all the other aspects of it as well. So they really need to see a complete picture, I think, before they make those kinds of decisions.
Okay. We have a question from Terry in Pennsylvania. Has EPA done any work creating a model ordinance that can be widely used to assist with putting BMPs to municipal use?
Yes, we have a model ordinance. It is on our website, so you can take a look at that. If you go to www.epa.gov/NPDES, and I believe if you just type the word model into the search box, it will come up for you. Also, the Center for Watershed Protection at www.cwp.org has model ordinances as well. And also, at the end of this presentation, those hot links will be repeated again, so you'll be able to get them.
Okay. We have a question from Sherry in Indiana. Is there any breakdown or requirement per department as to who is responsible for their local stormwater programs?
No. As you know, most states are authorized to implement the NPDES program, but no states are making a decision as to who has to be responsible. That's definitely a local government decision. And you'll find that varies from place to place. I said before that often it falls to the responsibility of the Public Works Department, but that can vary, and in fact, responsibilities are very often spread among different departments for different aspects of it. For instance, as you know, one of the minimum measures is the public education and involvement, and oftentimes a different department may be responsible for that one. So it can vary, and that's definitely a local decision, and again, something that needs to be thought about carefully.
Okay, thanks, Nikos. I think we'll go back to the presentation.
Okay. So now we're going to transition a little bit away from sort of these rules and requirements and basic elements and talk about some of the sort of new cutting-edge things that are going on. And the first area that we wanted to talk about is kind of the big picture, the macro level, the watershed scale of things that's going on. And as we mentioned before, Jeff will be joining us in just a second to talk about smart growth. But as you know, right now, the country is experiencing a lot of development. The real estate market in many parts of the country is extremely hot. Buildings are going up. Suburbs are sprawling out into what used to be farmland and all that kind of thing. And what we want to do is focus both on that big scale and on the smaller scale. So before we do that, though, we have a poll question here for you again, and this asks, are there discussions going on in your community now about smart growth? And maybe you've not heard that term of art before, but you can substitute other terms as well for that, but just kind of this basic idea about talking about environmentally sensitive growth patterns and that sort of thing. So again, take a second just to answer that question, and we'll show you the answer.
And Nikos, I'm on here now.
Very good, Jeff. I just have...
Sure.
Okay, so let's see, we've got some results. Again, great results. Take a look at this. Amazing. Well, Jeff, I guess you're doing your job well, because look, 66% of the people out there say they're having discussions about smart growth in their communities. That's amazing. So I guess we are focusing that way. The reason why we've decided recently to incorporate the smart growth into the smart growth program, at least at EPA, that's not right, Jeff. You're probably thinking that we're putting stormwater into smart growth, right?
Well, but we're a mix of both, probably.
Yeah, we're trying to join the two together, let's say that.
Yeah.
Is this observation that I've had for a while is that we in the stormwater community, I think, can sometimes focus a little bit too, shall we say, at the micro level. We're often concerned about fixing problems or installing BMPs on a particular site. And so, if you will, pardon this sort of analogy, but we're, kind of, our heads are a little bit down maybe in this program. And the more and more I think that if we're not looking up a little bit, we may find in a couple of years that sprawl has happened all over the place, this sort of uncontrolled development, and we may never be able to catch up with stormwater by trying to fix all these problems. So what we're trying to do now is to encourage you to be both looking at this broad picture to see what's going on within the watershed or within your community, and also to fix problems site by site by site. But I think we have to do the two together to really, meet this water quality goal. And so kind of with that, I guess I'll sort of turn it over to Jeff a little bit, and maybe, Jeff, start with a question there. But from your perspective, why do you see that sort of the time is so ripe for talks about smart growth, and particularly how does that connect to kind of water quality issues?
Well, thank you, Nikos. And before I answer that, let me just offer my thanks for having me as part of the webcast. I'm really excited to be here, and I think this is a great audience to be talking with about smart growth. The conversations you and I have been having between our offices over the last couple of years, I think, need to happen more broadly between people working on development trends overall and people really focusing on the water issues. That being said, I think the reason that it's so ripe is that people are getting, frankly, tired of a lot of the symptoms of current development patterns, and they are looking at the amount they're driving. In particular, they're looking at the consumption of open space and farmland. They're looking at school overcrowding, and they're kind of asking themselves, really, community by community, isn't there a better way to do this? And that, I think is an exciting opportunity for people in a variety of fields. Just, for instance, transportation planners have, in some ways, had their heads down as well and thought a lot about how to move traffic and how to move people from their places they're living to the places they're working, but haven't thought about trying to affect where the living and working is happening and whether that's close together or far apart. So this offers them an opportunity to solve traffic problems in a different way. By the same token, I think with respect to water, your statistics that we started off with, citing the amount that urban runoff contributes to rivers and lakes and estuarine pollution and so forth, are really telling in terms of the degree to which development has a big impact on the macro trends that certainly we're concerned about in EPA's water programs and in the Smart Growth program. The other interesting thing I just wanted to point out about those statistics is that we do say urban, but from my perspective, what we really mean is runoff from development, because urban is defined as such low density that virtually any kind of development that most people would be thinking of is classified as urban by the census. And so we really need to think about the impacts from runoff from development, whether it's urban or suburban. And I'm going to try the advancing the slide here, Nikos, but I may need to call on you. We'll see here. Oh, no? Good. Okay. But let me step back for a second and just talk about kind of what everyone knows, and that is that the current development patterns have had a very specific set of characteristics associated with them. It's very low density. It tends to be very land consumptive. It transforms farmlands, forest lands, working lands. Interestingly, in some ways it's a product of post-World War II planning, where on a map it looks really nice to have all my houses over here and my stores in the second place and my businesses in the third and my school in a fourth and my shopping in a fifth. So we've kind of taken the elements of neighborhood and broken them up into their separate pods, and then we drive around between them. And that, of course, has real implications when it comes to just how much we drive, and normally that's often considered an air concern, but everybody on this call most likely knows about the water deposition that eventually happens after that. In a lot of places where I talk about this, the first question I get is, well, population is going to keep growing, we can't do anything about that. And the thing that I don't think a lot of people realize, although increasingly they do, is that population is really being outstripped by development. So for 1% increase in population in a metropolitan area, you might get 7 or 8%. There are some places that have had, over the last 10 or 20 years, places like Detroit, places like Buffalo, have actually had no growth in population, or very limited amounts of growth in population, not only in the city, but in the metropolitan area, and have still expanded by 25%. And that has clear, it has clear water implications, but frankly, it's not only the water issues that are raising concerns and getting people to rethink those patterns of development. And you can see the trend of the increasing land consumption just by what's sort of normal in development, and that 80% of residential development tends to occur on the fringe of developed areas. So we're not so good traditionally at reusing land that we've used before. And then when we use new land, it tends to be on larger lots. So it's a very land consumptive pattern of development. And this is one of the interesting questions that has come up when you're thinking about smart growth in the context of water. Is I think it's probably less true on this call because the folks on this webcast are very familiar with these issues. But when I talk to local government officials frequently, they'll say, well, one of the reasons we want low density is in fact to protect water. And I think that is the result of a couple things. One is I think we've actually done a decent job of getting part of the story out from the Center for Watershed Protection about imperviousness and about limiting imperviousness at the site level. And then the other is that I think we are accustomed to thinking about our developments in a site-by-site or permit-by-permit basis. Let me just show you what I'm talking about a little bit here. I've got three scenarios here, one at 1 unit per acre of development, one at 4 units, and one at 8 units. And if you take what I think everyone on the phone would agree is sort of an improper application of the Center for Watershed Protection's paper and say, well, at the site level here, this 1 unit covers 20% of the lot, and the 8 units cover 65% of the lot. So that's, the 8 units are not good. And let me just pause for a moment and digress and say the example I'm going to run through here is intentionally overly simplistic. So I just want to beg your forbearance because it's not meant to be subtle. It's meant to make the overall point, and then to try to work our way back from the point to a more subtle application of these ideas. But when you look at the individual site level and you do the analysis, you say, well, 8 is worse than 1. And you can see that 1 unit per acre creates 20% imperviousness, and you can calculate the runoff from that from given storm events in a year, and you get 18,700 cubic feet of runoff. And for the 8 units per acre, for instance, you get 39,600 cubic feet of runoff. And so 39,000 is worse than 18,000. But it starts to get a little more interesting if you look at it on a runoff per unit basis, because the situation that most places are facing is not one of essentially growth versus no growth. Just to use the area I live in the D.C. region, we are not contemplating adding 5,000 houses over the next 10 years or 50,000. It's really more a question of where is 25,000 houses going to go? Because that amount of growth is coming somewhere here. And so how do we accommodate that in the best way? And that actually requires a different kind of analysis when you start to look at it. When you start to ask, how do we, in the example in these slides, accommodate 8 housing units in the least impactful way, you start to do a different analysis. You say, okay, we could accommodate the 8 units on one unit per acre, and that would use up 8 acres. And we could calculate the total runoff from that, and it's 149,000 cubic feet per year. And you compare that to the higher density scenario, and you get the total runoff of 39,000 cubic feet per year. And that tells a very different story, and would lead you to basically a different set of answers in terms of what the best way is in this scenario to protect water resources. And of course, everyone will recognize this as an application potentially of clustering. And we all are very familiar with that concept at the site level. But we can take it to the watershed level, which is really where smart growth is trying to engage these issues, is at a broader level. And you can see here the difference in accommodating 10,000 units of housing at 1 unit per acre again on the left-hand side in scenario A versus 10,000 units at 8 units per acre. And you see now that we're, again, using the Center for Watershed Protection's paper correctly, we're looking at the fact that the higher density scenario has essentially clustered the development at a big scale and ends up somewhere in the neighborhood of 8% impervious cover. And if you're smart about where you locate that and don't let that density go into fragile areas or important areas ecologically, you can really get some good performance from that. In contrast, the lower density scenario gets you about a 20% impervious cover. And we know from CWP's paper and other research that the 20% is going to lead to some rather important impacts within the watershed that we're trying to protect against. The question, of course, becomes, what happens to the development after that? And we've got another slide here that tries to take a look at that. And you can see that by accommodating the development in a more dense pattern in scenario C, you're still actually, for the next 10,000 units that come, you still have a good chunk of the original watershed left. And for scenario A, you've actually consumed a whole second watershed. And the differences there are similar to what you saw in the previous slide in terms of now you have 2 watersheds at 20% imperviousness and one at basically 16 or 17%. And that, of course, isn't to say that that if you were to ask me, do I want, because you could take this example and keep building it out and say, do I want 10 watersheds entirely built out or one built out at a much higher density? Obviously, and this is where we have to sort of start applying a little more subtlety to this example, you want neither. You want to concentrate the development strategically in different watersheds so that you can meet the carrying capacity. But this example is really meant to counteract the assumption that I think is out there among a lot of local officials that the lower density is the way to go, when in fact what we're seeing is the lower density is driving a lot of the land consumption that's leading to the degradation in our rivers, lakes, and estuaries that you started with, Nikos. So when we're thinking about density, that's only one small piece of smart growth. Density by itself does not work well. It needs a range of other principles and other techniques applied at the same time to make it work well. So density, where you have a lot of houses in one place and still have to drive a long way to get to the office, to get to school, to do any of the things that you'd like to be able to do in a neighborhood, doesn't help you with transportation, doesn't help you with air depth, doesn't help you with air emissions. So you need to mix land uses. You need to create a range of housing opportunities and choices, create walkable communities, obviously preserve the critical open space. Whether you're and that goes for whether you're going with high or low density development. One of the questions I get a lot is, well, the way that the high density can help to protect a watershed is if you guarantee that you're going to get the land conservation where the development didn't go. And that's absolutely important. We have to get that land conservation. But I would submit also that it's perhaps more important to get the land conservation with the lower density development, because that's the development that is chewing up the land at an incredibly rapid rate. So those are some of the principles that go into making neighborhoods work. They've been extracted really from the local level to see where communities have engaged these issues and tried to find solutions. So this is really an effort to copy success. And you come up with very similar principles around the country when you look at places that have addressed these issues. This is the second set of the 10. There are 10 principles that the Smart Growth Network has come up with, and as I said, it's a network of 36 organizations who didn't come up with this in isolation, but really looked around at what was creating success on the ground and tried to enunciate those principles so that other people would be aware of how communities were moving forward with this. So the implications are several when you think about water quality and smart growth and protecting water resources. And these are just a couple that I think are really important. I showed examples of 1 unit per acre versus 8 units per acre. And you could see a pretty steady increase in imperviousness between those. But if I were to show you the difference between 8 units per acre and 80 units per acre, you actually don't get a huge increase. You may between the 8 and the 16 units per acre, but after 16 units per acre or so, you don't get a huge increase in imperviousness. And in some senses, that's free land, and that's free growth that you've accommodated without adding any imperviousness. Other excellent examples of that are, again, here in the Washington region, we've had an incredible amount of redevelopment that all took place on previously developed sites, in a sense, sort of free imperviousness that we simply reuse. Another thing that people will often equate lawns with undisturbed land in terms of their ecological function and ability to infiltrate water and so forth, unless you take some of the special measures that are going to be discussed with LID. That tends not to be true, and I think everyone on this conference knows that. We didn't really talk about the imperviousness that is dictated by particular development forms that aren't on site. So if you have low density development at one or 2 units per acre, you have to understand that sends a clear signal to the traffic engineers that you're going to need a lot of roads and a lot of wide roads, and to the retailers that basically the places that their customers are going to agglomerate in a way that they could actually efficiently serve them, it's going to be on strip arterial development with large parking lots. And so, we need to think about the whole picture rather than just individual sites. So when we think about which is better, and this makes that point about that I just made in the previous slide, that the housing on the left there is invariably served by the retail on the right. And so when we think about whether this is a fabulous conservation design, we really need to think about does it lead to fabulous conservation retail as well, and fabulous traffic conservation techniques as well. But when we think about smart growth, my point in presenting this is certainly not that high density is always the answer. It's not. You really have to look at the individual situation, have to preserve the critical green space. But I think the assumption, the default out there right now tends to be that lower density works better as the de facto answer for protecting water. And in many cases, that's not helping and may even be hurting us. So I just want to leave you with that and give you a couple of resources that we've been putting together that spell out some of these ideas in greater detail. You can find them at epa.gov/smartgrowth. I would also refer you to smartgrowth.org, a website that the EPA supports. And with that, I think we can maybe take a couple questions.
Yes, thanks, Jeff. We do have a number of questions that we'll go through. Ruth in Missouri wants to know, many codes and ordinances tend to conflict with better site design. In addition to overlay zones and using public utility districts, how are communities addressing this roadblock?
Well, there's actually a shocking amount of demand for rewriting and reconstructing codes out there. They are using overlay zones. They're creating mixed-use districts. They're using PUDs. And a lot of people are turning to something called form-based codes. And so I think there are basic improvements that you can make to just to your regular codes just by being more thoughtful and innovative about what things you're requiring of developers. One of the things that I give in my normal talk is just to note that in many cases the reasons we're getting these pods of development separated by wide arterials with only one way to get there and one way to get back is exactly because we have made that the mandate under our zoning codes, our traffic engineering standards, and it's often dictated essentially by the local government. The market is actually turning in a different direction in many ways.
We have two questions that are along a similar track, but different codes, one from California, one from Maryland. And the gist is related to clustering. Mm-hmm. And the concern is that clustering leaves pieces of land, public or private, that could be developed in the future. In 20 years, the undeveloped land that is available due to clustering becomes too valuable and thus becomes subject to development pressures. How do you keep the remaining area of the watershed from being developed?
Well, I think that's always a question, and I think it's important not to confuse two issues because there are a couple there, and I want to use Manhattan oddly as not quite as a paragon of ecologic virtue, but I want to pose an alternate scenario to everyone on the phone. That suppose for the moment, and in building Manhattan, I think we all would acknowledge there were no additional open space set-aside prerequisites for having that kind of density. And again, I'm going to employ extreme examples here. But even absent that, now imagine if that density was instead developed at 4 units per acre. Manhattan would stretch to Ohio. So there has been additional development around, the higher density areas, but that hasn't removed over time the fact that they have in fact saved land area. It is not by any means adequate, but I think the danger that I would point out is just to make sure that you are not asking for land set-asides as a prerequisite for higher density. I think it's got to be a prerequisite or attached equally to low density and high density. Low density is consuming more land than the high density development, and so if you're going to be looking to preserve the land, you don't want to accidentally send an incentive to developers that we're going to make the high density harder and more expensive. They know what to do in that case. They'll go do the easy, cheap stuff. So that being said, I think the first thing you do is you look for a way that to preserve land that it doesn't load an extra burden onto higher density development, and hopefully provide some recognition of the benefits that it can provide. And I looked at things like transfer of development rights. Some communities have used down zoning very effectively. The state of Maryland, I think, has done a good job of combining a couple different sets of policies. At least in the past, they have outlined essentially a green space preservation priority map where they direct their green space preservation dollars, and it sends a good signal to the NGO community about where to target their investments. At the same time, the state also directed their public expenditures for development and for economic development into growth areas. So they weren't sending conflicting signals that we want to conserve this area and grow in it. They were saying we're going to grow over here and we're going to conserve over there. So I thought that was a very good approach that allowed them to step back and really look at the ecological value of the lands in question and figure out how to use their state budget as a way to not only get the land conservation, but also to get the development where they wanted it.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. We'll come back to you a little bit later, but first let's turn it back over to Nikos, who will talk about low-impact development.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, very much. And in this next section, we're going to talk about low-impact development. As we mentioned, Jeff was talking about, the watershed scale, the big picture scale. So now we're going to change gears a little bit and talk about that smaller scale again. And I think you'll see by the time we're done with this presentation that these two things can work together. In fact, I think they have to work together in order for us to be successful. When we talk about site design, again, these are, as I mentioned before, decisions that we're going to be living with, for maybe as many as 100 years. So we really need to think carefully about what we're doing and design our municipal programs in a way that we can accommodate the kind of growth that we are inevitably going to have. The population of the United States continues to grow and is projected to continue to grow for quite some time. So we are going to have growth. There's certainly no argument about that. But how can we deal with that in the best possible way? And so Jeff touched on some ideas about how to do that at the watershed scale or the broader scale. And now low-impact development, which is an idea, a philosophy that's been around for quite a while, focuses a little bit more on sort of site-by-site kinds of distinctions. So let's get into that. First of all, I think it's a fair thing to say that some of the traditional stormwater management ideas that we've had, say over the past 30 years, have often exacerbated the problem. If you will allow me, it seems almost as though we had sort of this underlying thought that maybe somehow we were all allergic to stormwater, and we had better get rid of that stormwater, get it away from us as fast as we can. So we built a lot of conveyance systems that were essentially designed to move that water away. And in that process, we have created, many of the problems, or it certainly contributed to many of those sorts of problems that we were talking about before, about blowing out small streams with intense velocities and volumes of water, and the degradation of habitat and all that kind of stuff. And so what we're finding now is that if we can change that dynamic or that paradigm a little bit more and talk about treating stormwater right on the source, right where it falls, so that we're not sort of gathering it up, but we're sort of micromanaging it. This may be the only time you'll ever hear that micromanagement may be a good thing, but here we go, micromanagement is a good thing. So we're after both reducing that, the pollution, the chemistry content, or perhaps eliminating it, and as well as the volume. So those are sort of the two principles there. So again, we're using kind of small-scale systems. We don't want that water to get very far away from where it fell before we deal with it. And of course, the key here is infiltration. We want to maximize our infiltration potential as much as we can, both so we get groundwater recharge, which is becoming a critical issue in many parts of the country, particularly in more arid areas, but anywhere really that people are relying on groundwater as a drinking water supply, we're finding those groundwater levels are going down. And also, as I mentioned before, just a base flow to our rivers and streams. So we can do all those sorts of stuff. You'll also see that some of these techniques really reduce infrastructure costs, both capital costs and long-term maintenance costs. And we're, again, trying to restore those sort of ecological functions, the hydrologic sort of integrity of our watersheds and that sort of thing. So here's a couple pictures, the kinds of techniques that we're going to cover. Interestingly enough, we mentioned before that these have aesthetic value, and I think as you'll see, we have some nice pictures coming up here that will, I think, impress you with how they look as well. So these things definitely don't have to be ugly eyesores on the landscape. They can be designed in ways that are very appealing. So again, our focus here is small-scale systems and infiltration, and we'll be talking about many of those benefits that go along with that. One of the things that we want to try to do is reduce some of the infrastructure, the big stormwater pipes. If we can, curbs and gutters, those things that kind of gather up stormwater and channel it. We want to reduce building footprints. We want to sort of maximize the amount of permeable area that we have around the buildings that we do. We want to be careful about particular things like sensitive soils, soils that might erode very easily, and oftentimes we don't sort of think about that. Jeff talked about reducing road widths and reducing parking lot sizes or changing the design of our parking lots so that they aren't quite so big, or perhaps even in some cases choosing not to build them all together is certainly another option. And then, of course, our overall goal is to reduce impervious surfaces. Okay, so what we're trying to do is to basically maintain the natural hydrology of a site, or to keep that as constant as we possibly can. And there's a number of techniques that we can use to do that, and we'll talk about those in the slides coming up. But basically, ideas like open drainage, again, not channeling things through pipes. If we can, to reduce certain slopes in certain areas so that we don't pick up speed, pick up that velocity as water is moving along. We want to sort of lengthen the time that water can stay in a particular area so that we, again, maximize the infiltration. Preserve certain very critical areas, particularly headwater areas, those riparian zones around the small first-order streams. And maximizing sheet flow, for those that don't know, I talked about not concentrating stormwater. And stormwater flows over a surface. It starts out as sheet flow, like you could imagine, say, on a parking lot. But as soon as it hits something, it'll start to concentrate. And we want to try to avoid that as much as possible so we don't get those concentrated flows, because that's where we have more difficulty in managing that as soon as we concentrate it. So we have all these alternatives. And probably one of the biggest things we want to try to do is the curb and gutter thing. And I have to put in my little spiel about parking lots. Actually, in Jeff's resource slide, you noticed a guidance document about parking lots. And, you know, it's kind of a surprising thing, but, you know, I could pretty much say that almost every single parking lot in the United States is designed incorrectly. And it's not as though this were something new that we just learned yesterday, but these ideas have been around for a long time, but somehow we keep managing to repeat the same bad patterns over and over again. First of all, we have parking lots that serve, in many areas, just one particular store. We're seeing that a lot with these with the big box retailers. Each store has to have its own parking lot. So you get the stores that are farther and farther apart, and you get all these parking lots that are empty all the time. If you drive by, you will see many, 90% empty spaces, but these parking lots are designed for the day after Thanksgiving. And so if we keep designing that way, you know, we're having a lot of impervious surface out there that really is basically serving no purpose. So at the highest level, we need to look at that. once we sort of looked at the size and the distribution and the sharing of parking lots between different stores and that sort of stuff, we also need to look at the design. And somebody pointed this out to me, and it's something that's really stuck into my head. But if you want to look at a parking lot and try to decide whether it's been designed in an environmentally conscious way, the one thing that you can do, and you can tell this to anybody, your mother will understand this, if the dirt that's surrounding those trees is above the level of the pavement or the blacktop, it is designed wrong, because none of that water is going to make it up over the curb and into that tree box and infiltrate into the ground. So in the picture you see here, you see where that ground level is actually lower than the level of the surface. So water that's coming off the parking lot is actually channeled into that area and allowed the possibility of infiltrating. The other picture shows pervious pavement, pavers. There's different varieties of that. We'll talk about that in a minute. But that certainly is another option, particularly for those outlying areas that maybe you're only going to use on a Saturday when it's really busy, that are going to get lighter use. You might also consider those sorts of things. So there are a number of low-impact development techniques, and you'll find many, many varieties within these, but these are sort of some of the major groupings here, and we'll talk about each one of those as we go along real quickly, and I'll show you some pictures. The first one is disconnectivity. This basically means disconnecting some of these downspouts. And it's amazing how much water can infiltrate in a particular area. And this particular option is extremely low cost. All you need is a hacksaw. Doesn't cost very much. Go out there and chop that thing right off, and boom, you've achieved your goal. Here we're looking at a parking garage, and you can see that this large area of parking structure is being infiltrated into a relatively small area. Can't quite see the whole picture here, but it does work. Now, one of the arguments that some people will raise about this is, oh, well, I have poor soils, poor draining soils, I can't do this at all. And that's not exactly true. Depending on the soil type that you have and the amount of rainfall and the kinds of patterns that you have, you may be able to do more or less of this, but you can always do some. And I'll show you in a couple minutes some different ways that these BMPs can be designed for different conditions to kind of maximize that value. Another thing we can do here is open swales. We talked about not having those underground pipes to channel the stormwater away. And particularly on the left, you can see after a relatively heavy rain, that open swale there has got some standing water in that, and that will infiltrate over a couple hours after that rain stops. Now, let's say you're living in an area with poor soils, and you say, well, I can't do that. Well, you might want to look at a rainfall pattern for a year for your particular area. In our area, it's interesting that something like 80% of the rainfall events are less than half an inch. Those are relatively small. So only a few are these sort of bigger ones. So we could design these kinds of swales so that they might infiltrate that half inch, and we've got 80% of the rain during the year infiltrated. Now, in those times where it goes over that, maybe we have some kind of a check dam or a spillway or something, and for those really big events, some of that volume then, is transported away in a more traditional way. But again, these things, can be designed for and thought about. The simple elements to that calculation are your rainfall patterns and the kinds of soils that you're dealing with. And even with an unamended soil, pretty dense clay, you can still infiltrate quite a bit. So these are things that can be figured out. The next slide talks about bioretention cells, and that's just kind of a fancy word for a particular area that's been dug up and engineered with some soils and some rocks and whatnot so that it maximizes infiltration. So in a parking lot situation, for instance, we talked about before, you've got a relatively large area of surface coming into a relatively small area. If you dig up that soil and amend it, make it a little bit better, let's say you have a kind of a clay base, amend it with better soil, some sand, some rock. They often do these in different layers. You can really vastly increase the holding capacity of that particular area. These things also can be designed and are often designed with overflow features so that, again, when you have those enormous events, the part that cannot be infiltrated will be carried away in a more traditional manner. But you still, again, can infiltrate a great deal by using these sort of simple, really pretty simple devices. Here's another picture coming up here about parking lots. And I sort of already did my spiel on parking lots and how badly they're designed. So, this is something where it's really time for a major change in the way we're kind of doing business. And I think a lot of that, as Jeff alluded to, starts with local codes. Often local codes are the ones that are prescribing these kinds of, not only the size of them, but the designs of them and the use of curbs and that sort of stuff. We saw some pictures, in fact, the picture on the bottom right there is of a designed parking lot, but the top picture there is a retrofit, simply a curb cut there to allow that water to get past the curb and into the area, which magically has been lowered a little bit, so the water will actually run, as it likes to do, going downhill, not uphill. The next slide shows something that's very similar to the bioretention cells, but it's called a rain garden because it's lower tech. And rain gardens are a kind of thing that make for a very good sort of community involvement kind of project. These things are things that homeowners can install themselves into their yards. And as you can see from the pictures, they're very attractive. They're often populated with wildflowers and native plants and things like that. And many communities have been finding these, actually it's kind of a way to get kind of something started is to work with a local garden club to get them to start doing it, the people who are sort of really most interested in doing this sort of stuff. And then, lo and behold, without any sort of advertising or marketing or requirements, their neighbors will say, well, what is that you're doing over there? Why have you put this little depression in the front yard, and why are you planting it that way? And why did you direct your downspouts over in that direction? And, the idea can kind of spread, from those people who are sort of most interested to the next group of people. So this does make for a great project that would meet your community involvement requirements under your Phase 2 program, and also a way to gain some real water quality benefits. The next one is, and while it's loading here, is permeable pavement and porous pavers. And just to quickly say that permeable concrete is a technology that's been out there for quite a while, and frankly, it had a bad rap many years ago. Since then, the industry has done many wonderful things to improve the structure and the quality of this concrete so that it is quite durable. It can be used, it's in fact very popular now in Georgia and Florida, but it can be used in northern climates as well. It's very well suited to parking lots, to secondary roads that are not subject to high traffic, to driveways and things like that, and requires very low maintenance. Sometimes, if it's kind of a new idea, you'll find that the costs are higher, but as more and more people use it, the price comes down as the distributors figure out how to do it and have more and more orders for it. In fact, now in Florida and Georgia, the price is the same as regular concrete. There's sort of no barrier there. In fact, very shortly we're going to be publishing a new fact sheet on permeable concrete, and that'll be up on our website in about 2 months. So you'll see that very shortly. Green roofs are another area that is starting to catch on, very popular in Europe, but not as well known in the United States. And they're sort of seen as kind of an exotic thing by many sort of people. But there's also some interesting literature on this, and this is another area that we'll have a new fact sheet up on our website in about 2 months. And some of the benefits of this are very interesting. The costs for installing a green roof are obviously a little bit higher than a traditional. But one of the interesting facts is that these green roofs last considerably longer than any other roof material, simply because the roof material itself is not exposed to UV light, which is what causes the degradation of most roof materials. They also provide insulation benefits in ultra-urban areas. They provide relief from the heat island effect. And they can also be an aesthetic improvement to a building with a little walkway and benches and things like that. The city of Chicago now has a requirement that all new municipal buildings have a green roof, and they have voluntary programs in place for commercial. We have several in Washington, D.C. In fact, the Department of Interior is installing a green roof on the interior headquarters here in Washington, D.C. The next one is rain barrels, and this one is something that's often talked about as a community involvement project. There's certainly many, many examples out there of communities sponsoring kind of rain barrel events and getting people involved. And up to this time, I've always said, well, that's a great thing to do, to get people involved, to educate them about stormwater, but it's not going to really provide you with any benefits at all. And I've been proven wrong recently, in fact, by some of the folks who are sitting here with me being very quiet. There was actually a very detailed water quality model put together for a particular neighborhood where they evaluated about 10 different low-impact development BMPs on different sites within a several-block area, and they went through thousands of scenarios, literally, to evaluate the effectiveness and the cost. And they found that rain barrels actually can provide some benefit at relatively low cost. Certainly, a solution's never going to be all rain barrels, but they certainly can actually help, particularly in an ultra-urban area where you don't have many other options because of size constraints. The last area we're going to talk about is just simple soil amendments. As Jeff mentioned before, grass is not the equivalent of trees. And as particularly areas like municipal ball fields and playgrounds and things like that, as they become more and more compacted, they're more and more like an impervious surface as time goes by. So some simple soil amendments, just digging it up, stirring it up, perhaps adding some amending things like humus or whatever, can vastly increase its infiltration capacity, and again, very low-tech, low-expense kind of thing that communities may want to particularly consider in high-traffic areas. So, and the last, planter boxes, again, for those ultra-urban areas, probably not going to buy you, a whole lot of stormwater reduction, but it's a good way to educate people about stormwater and get them to do something. So it may also provide you with that education opportunity that you can take credit for. So here's a poll question. Are any low-impact development BMPs used or encouraged in your community? So let's say that, they're actually, you've seen some out there. That's sort of let's use that as kind of a threshold. You've seen some on the landscape, not just sort of the theoretical. So again, some choices. Maybe yes, they are. They're out on the landscape. Maybe your government is working on it. No, we're not sure. And let's see what people say. Okay, and so there's the results. About 35% said yes. Hey, that's great. In fact, that's higher than I would have thought. And it's also very encouraging to see that some 32% are working on it. We've got some laggards there in the purple bar there, the no's, so we need to change some of that around. So I hope after this is over, you'll start running around and saying, we need low-impact development BMPs, so hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. Okay, we just have a couple more examples here, and for those of you that are on the line with us, we're approaching the 3 o'clock hour here, and we can, with the system, go a few minutes over. So I think I'm going to take my liberty and extend this for just maybe 5 minutes more so that we can get some questions at the end. Jeff talked about this already, but looking at other ordinances in your community is particularly important. Not just having that stormwater ordinance, but looking at the other ones that might be impacting you. Fire codes are a big one because they often dictate street widths, and you may need to really, do an education campaign with your fire chief to get him to see that, in fact, you don't need to get 3 hook and ladders down the same street simultaneously at the same time. But, there's all kinds of things that are out there. Codes that describe how streets are built, that whole curb and gutter issue that we've talked about, parking requirements, et cetera, et cetera. So those are some of the areas to look at. And actually, the Center for Watershed Protection has a very good document on how to evaluate your codes. And again, the center's website will be up at the end. So we mentioned before that some of these low-impact development techniques can actually enhance property values. And if you just look at the slides here, the left side obviously is more conventional. The right side is a low-impact kind of design. And you can instantly see, and yes, sure, we selected these pictures to make the point we want, but you can instantly see that the right side is more attractive than the left side, right? And let's look at a study from Prince George's County in Maryland where they actually did a cost study, which is quite revealing. Just to make this quick, you can come back to this at your leisure and look at the details. But comparing the very same site with 2 different designs, one a conventional design and the other a low-impact design, the total costs were reduced primarily because of less infrastructure. Reducing the costs associated with all that curb and gutter and pipe and whatnot. Unit costs were reduced, and the lot yield, interestingly, was actually increased, primarily in this case because they didn't have to have an enormous wet pond that took up much acreage. So you can see that there's definitely benefits for developers in choosing to use these kinds of techniques, and that's something that, everything is about convincing people, so that's one thing that, you should definitely point out as you're doing your education work. So, kind of in conclusion, I want you to kind of come away with the message that the post-construction program is, in fact, perhaps the key element behind the success, our long-term success of the stormwater program. And I hope between Jeff's talk and my talk on low-impact development that you can see that these 2 things can actually work together, that we don't just have to have, high density or low density, but what we really need is sort of good planning at the watershed level and then good installation on each site. And so I think we really need to figure out ways to make these 2 ideas work together. As I mentioned before, we will have a comprehensive post-construction document, guidance document that's going to cover everything from soup to nuts that a community might need to know. And we're hoping that to have that in late 2006. And it'll cover everything from ordinances to the kinds of BMPs to the smart growth ideas that Jeff was talking about, et cetera, et cetera. And so we have a couple minutes left, so let's take a couple more questions. And then at the end, I know we have a survey for you to fill out, and we'll show you some resources as well.
Yes, in fact, I think we'll give a few bits of information before the questions. We do have some additional time, but first I do want to remind you that this seminar will be archived, so you can access it after today's live presentation. The archived webcast will be posted by March 21st. And also, for your information, we have been getting hundreds of questions submitted, many of them on the similar topics, and we will do our best to get answers to those questions posted on EPA's NPDES website in the near future. So we do encourage you to revisit that site in the near future. Nikos has posted his contact information and a short list of resources in his slides. We'll go ahead and push those now. You can also find a more comprehensive stormwater management resource list by pressing the Resources button on your screen. Note that you'll need Adobe Acrobat Reader to view this document. Finally, we will be sending a webcast evaluation survey that should soon appear on your screen. Please consider completing this survey and let us know your thoughts. We do appreciate your feedback as we work to improve this webcast. And if you do not see the evaluation survey on the screen, please be reminded that you need to turn off your pop-up blocker. You can do this by pressing the Control key on your keyboard. Now we do have time for additional questions. Nikos, Andrea in Ohio picks Duke, Indiana, Kentucky, and Ohio State. And she wants to know, how do you select or design BMPs to reduce maintenance costs?
I'm sorry, we're having a little technical faux pas here with the screen. Sorry, Ron, repeat the question.
How do you select or design BMPs to reduce maintenance costs?
Well, that is an important area, and it's not something, frankly, that's well documented at this point. There have been some studies and papers out there. If you do Google search or whatever, I'm sure that you can find some descriptions of long-term maintenance costs for different BMPs. But I have to say that, the sort of comprehensiveness of that information is not really there at this point. But it certainly would be an important consideration. At least I would recommend at this point, doing the searches that you can and using your sort of best judgment to estimate what those costs will be over the long term and kind of factoring that into, a long-term 20-year plan or so. That area is something, again, that's developing, and the research on that is, this is a field that keeps changing all the time, and so we hope that will improve over time. But right now I would use sort of the, search around to see what's been published already, and then use your best judgment to estimate those and put those estimates into a 20-year plan.
Okay, Brandon from California wants to know, do you see LID design becoming city, county, or state policy in the near future?
Jeff, are you still with us?
I am.
What do you think about that?
I think there are places that have already adopted LID as a county policy, so I think it depends where you are, but I would be surprised, actually, if down the road this wasn't a fairly common policy, frankly.
Yeah, and Jeff, I would add the state of Pennsylvania is just revising their BMP manual, and it's heavily weighted towards low-impact development techniques. And, of course, we know and already mentioned that Maryland has done the same thing. And it's kind of been kind of a pioneer in that area.
Right.
So, yeah, I definitely agree with you, Jeff, that this low-impact development and the smart growth areas are areas that we're going to see policies on at the state, county, and local level.
Okay, we'll give Jeremy the honor of the last question. Jeremy is in San Diego, California, and he asks, isn't the clogging of permeable pavement a major maintenance problem?
Again, I mentioned that permeable pavement had a bad rap, and that indeed was one of the sort of urban legends that was going around about it. But in fact, that turns out not to be true. There's been a lot of testing of it, and permeable pavement has such a high infiltration capacity, something like 600 inches of water an hour can go through permeable pavement, so that even if you dump a load of sand on top of it, you still have plenty of capacity for any rain event that you would ever encounter. The only exception that I would mention to that is if this permeable pavement happens to be installed in an area where there's very silty clay soil, and that soil is not stabilized. Say there's a bank or something next to this particular area, and that silt may be washing off right onto the permeable concrete. In that case, it is possible, although still highly unlikely, that you might run into a problem. But basically, that's an urban legend, and it has not come out to be true in any kind of testing, mainly because of the overall infiltration capacity of the stuff in the first place. When was the last time you saw a 600-inch per hour rain event? Okay.
Do we have time for one more?
Sure. Let's have one more.
This one is...
Let's just keep going.
This one is rather timely. Steve in Montclair, I believe that's New Jersey, wants to know how much consideration should be made for West Nile virus when designing landscape BMPs.
Well, Nikos, I think this is more your area, but certainly I think not only West Nile, but simply pest control. I mean, I think you have to think about what the detention times are going to be, but I think those, with good engineering are relatively solvable.
In fact, there's been quite a bit of work. In fact, we just finished working with, believe it or not, there's an association for everything, and there's a mosquito control association, and we've been working with the engineers and scientists there on a fact sheet, which is now up on our website, and a guidance document for wet ponds that will shortly be up there. And basically what you want to make sure is that you don't have water standing for more than 7 days, because after 7 days you do have the possibility of mosquitoes breeding. So any of the kinds of techniques that we're talking about in the low-impact development area where we're retaining water, we're talking about short periods of time, in the order of hours, that it might be on the surface there, and certainly not 7 days. And that's, again, for those big rain events, why we want to make sure that we can, when we need to, move that water away if we don't have that infiltration capacity. There's also some other information about mosquitoes, but I encourage you to look at that guidance document. We should have that out by the end of the month, and we're just kind of putting the final touches on it right now.
Okay, thank you very much. At this time, I would like to conclude today's webcast. Thank you, Nikos and Jeff, for presenting today, and of course, thanks to everyone who joined us the second time around. We encourage you to visit EPA's NPDES training courses and workshops webpage for notices about upcoming webcasts. And as I mentioned earlier, we will try to post a summary of the questions that were submitted as well as the answers to this webcast. The website is www.epa.gov/NPDES/training. Future webcast topics will include stormwater utilities and illicit discharge detection and elimination. Our next webcast is scheduled for May 10th. Barry Tonning of Tetra Tech will describe the elements of an effective municipal construction management program. Barry's presentation will also include an interesting local government case study. So please mark your calendars for this sure-to-be-intriguing webcast, May 10th. Registration information will be posted on the EPA's NPDES website, the address that I just gave you a minute ago. Thank you very much. That ends our webcast for today.